All right. What's like number four? I am on a serious roll. Hopefully, this is going to be a habit now. And once it becomes a habit, it's going to be much easier to motivate myself to keep doing it, which I think is going to be important in the next few months. Work's going to quiet down over Christmas, I should think, and this is an opportune time for me to do work towards PhD, but it's likely that I'll just waste the time and play video games because there's a few good ones to get through right now. Anyway, so I'm continuing reading How to Read a Film, the James Monaco book I was talking about in yesterday's video. Excuse me. So yesterday I started the chapter on reading a film, and it talks specifically in the first part of the chapter about paradigm rather than syntax, symbols, denotive and connotative, and iconography and different symbol systems. So today I've started on syntax, and Monaco's broken down syntax construction in terms of how meaning is conveyed through different arrangements of signs and symbols via the different methods within cinema, and describes them as codes, quite a common word that's used outside of even just cinema to talk about anything that has a language, specifically visual. I would think art talks about codes as well, in terms of there is language happening in a close-up shot of someone's eyes. There is coded meaning within there that we can ascribe, but cinematic techniques allow us to find codes which are specific to cinema. So at the start of this section, Monaco, in his usual style, actually there was something I was going to quote. I don't want to make this just a reading critique too often, but something about Monaco's writing does rub me slightly the wrong way sometimes. So yesterday I mentioned how Monaco will just make a point which I completely disagree with, and then later on expand on that point, which is an interesting and possibly useful way to teach these ideas, but it doesn't necessarily contradict themselves much or admit that actually the thing that's said before is not true, and here is the new truth. The first line in this section, I'm sorry, I should have highlighted this. I didn't think I was going to mention it, but it is worth noting, especially for myself, if I come back to rely on Monaco for anything, is it's a straight contradiction. Film has no grammar, a point made in the last section. There are, however, some vaguely defined rules of usage in cinematic language and the syntax of film. So now Monaco's doing what I just described and starting to build in a contrary direction to a point previously made, for the sake of adding information in a piecemeal form, not giving us everything all at once, but building on it. But that's essentially building to an ultimate contradiction of that very sentence, or that very phrase that Monaco's reasserting: film has no grammar. And then the chapter proceeds to describe the grammar of film, essentially. Whether or not it's a strict definition of grammar, I feel is slightly irrelevant. It does have certain structural rules that are followed. I didn't highlight this part. Later in this section, Monaco actually says there is no academy anywhere sitting and dictating what different codes in cinema mean. No one anywhere is saying, or in fact what the codes actually are, or how you can label one thing and say that's what that thing is. There is no one sitting somewhere saying a medium close-up is exactly this and a close-up is exactly this. There is middle ground between those two distances, and in fact different shots between those two differences, which makes them quite a flexible term. And I thought that was quite interesting because obviously French, for example, has l'Académie Française, which is very didactically and purposefully declaring what French language is. It says this is this word, it means this, and we're not going to use that other word, which is too anglicized probably. Other languages I don't know for everyone, because I don't know that many languages, but English, I mean, you know, an official word will appear in the Oxford English Dictionary, and we have every year a little bit of tabloid outrage whenever a new trendy word has entered the dictionary. I'm trying to think what word it was that was big news for a while. It wasn't clusterfuck, apologies, but it was it was omnishambles. There it is. Words like that. Someone somewhere does get to say, well, this goes in the dictionary now. That's a word that we use, but there is nothing in cinema where someone's sitting and going, oh, well, that's a convention now. That's officially language now. Instead, what we see is a repeated use of conventions, and that's how they become language. And it relates back to that quote from Metz in the last section about the users of the language become the creators of the language, essentially. So aside from that, and criticizing his writing, because actually I think there is some very good information in this book, and I would recommend reading it despite what I'm saying. One aspect that came out of Monaco's delve into the grammar or non-grammar of film was specifically about identifying what is specific to film itself and what isn't just a code that was developed in another art form. So Monaco talks a lot about audio and photography and art, traditional art and sculpture and visual audio mediums that exist everywhere else, and then says, well, yeah, sure, so we can montage, we can cut from one location to another perhaps, and see a parallel story occurring, but we can also see that in literature. That's nothing new to cinema. But then goes on to talk about the shower scene in Psycho, the murder scene, and the rapid succession of shots in there showing one action, not taking us to anything new, but showing us one little nugget of information. Actually, yeah, that is specific to cinema, is the conclusion. That is a system of telling a bit of story that isn't really paralleled in literature or any other art form for that matter. There's nothing in literature really that gives you that same device without an author having to actually clumsily describe a close-up of a knife or just the eyes of the victim. They may dwell on those descriptions of those objects and stylize the writing in some ways, but the simple presentation of shot after shot after shot of those very sparse details isn't something that literature really allows. So montage in that sense is a cinematic form. And Monaco goes on to find other elements which are specific to cinema language and not other forms, not codes where you'll find in any other art form really. And not to go through them bit by bit and to pull apart essentially everything he wrote, what I will say is that unsurprisingly, it boils down to movement. The new language cinema allows is movement. And cinema, obviously, again, I'm going with the obviously's, cinema being a word that comes from kinesthetic, kinematograph. It means movement in the name. Cinema means movement. So moving image, that's what we're dealing with here. So it's quite unsurprising to me that the language cinema creates is language allowed by movement. There aren't many art forms, any? Possibly not. Animation, I would argue, falls under the same umbrella here. But very few other art forms that have movement as part of their core. And therefore, the language, the artistic language cinema has, is a language of movement. So going from that conclusion about what the specific languages in cinema are as opposed to other art forms now helps me a little bit on my path to finding out what a specific language to YouTube would be. And I've sketched out a couple of initial ideas. It's not movement. It's not the movement-based conventions or codes, because cinema has those. There's very little that a video can do that cinema hasn't already done, I should think. However, one thing I thought would be interesting would be to examine YouTube not as a series of videos isolated from each other, but as a genre or a format in itself, in the same way that Monaco is able to draw on specific films like Psycho and to say this exemplifies this point in cinema. I need to think about the idea that actually I'm talking about YouTube as an artistic format. Some people may argue that word artistic there, but I'm going to be talking about it as an artistic format because it is an expression of language beyond just the common tongue. It's not just a written or spoken word. It is coding a meaning into something that is not that meaning. And it's an artistic practice, ultimately. Whether or not the content creators view themselves as artists, that is an artistic practice, I would argue. So viewing YouTube as a format for artistic expression, I can draw on videos that lie within YouTube to talk about things like the diverse nature of the length of the video. Cinema does have a lot of different varying lengths within it, but they fall within very specific categories. There are feature films, and there are short films, and there are films made for TV, and the lengths of these productions often are a reflection of the format for cinema that they're falling within. Whereas YouTube kind of there's just videos that are as long as they need to be. There's little example of that, I would say, within cinema, but YouTube absolutely has just a plethora of videos which are times it takes to say the thing they want to say. And that's it. They're not dictated by length. Yeah, maybe that's a good point to draw on. Like cinema, in some ways, is dictated by length. It has to reach a certain minute count to qualify as a certain product. YouTube allows a video just to be on YouTube, regardless of length. There are probably technical limitations in there. That'll be something I'll have to look into. But so far, I'm posting these horrendously length videos, and I've definitely watched longer on YouTube, so I'm yet to find it. The other ideas for looking at YouTube as a platform for artistic expression, it's a diverse archive. It's a truly diverse archive. And again, cinema has something like this. There are many genres, and genres within genres, there are subgenres. We look at documentary, and that is not just one type of film. There are thousands of different types of documentary talking about different types of subjects. And then we go into the narrative fiction area, and there's a lot there. There's art film, again, which has a lot of subgenres within it. So this isn't totally new to YouTube, but what is new to YouTube is the level of diversity in production type, I would say. Not genre, that's not the word I would choose to use there, but production type. A serious piece of, let's say, reporting, perhaps, that makes its way onto YouTube, could be produced via many means. It could be delivered like this. It could be shot in a very traditional journalistic style on location with reporters with microphones. It could be presented through animation. It could just be a person reading out some text that appears on your screen. There are many ways to present this. And what YouTube importantly does not have is a regulatory body saying, you may not broadcast this. You can just do that if you want. You can put up whatever you like as long as it falls within the content guidelines for what is acceptable. Again, we go back to that older idea that I took from some reading on YouTube about the gatekeepers of production, and the audiences that get to see it are not necessarily going to be just people who are looking for a news source. They're not going to come across necessarily that one video some guy thought it would be great if I animated this story. There's an algorithm at work. There's an attention economy at work, making sure people are fed videos that are going to keep them using a video site. So it's not necessarily as effective as a regulatory body or a news channel, for example, that constantly pumps out news because it has a pre-existing audience. It's built up and established. That pre-existing audience that it's built up and established want a certain style of delivery. So that would be the key difference there, is that delivery is free, but audience is not guaranteed. Another possible one, and this is a bit tenuous, I think, but another thought that drifted through my mind while I was thinking of what is unique to YouTube if movement is unique to cinema. It would be the aesthetic of the presenters on vlogs specifically, but other pieces of YouTubery that happen around the place. We often see behind the scenes in a YouTube video. We don't necessarily separate the means of production from the production itself. There is, outside of the YouTube fiction content, there is an understanding then that this content is produced by people who will just have access to means of production. We often see those means of production in the videos themselves. A very basic example of this is a vlogger wearing headphones with a microphone. That would be a sign, a code to us that this is a piece of YouTube literature, and sort of start suggesting an idea of truth. In Monaco's writing, Monaco mentions a lot about how different Hollywood codes or different cinema codes across the world are able to represent or repress verisimilitude, how they exemplify truth. And Monaco talks about how different strategies have been employed to reach this. For example, lighting. Hollywood has gone for a very flat, neutral lighting with key highlights that actually don't exist in real life, but it takes the idea of lighting away from our perception. It's not a barrier between the observer and the production. We don't think about the lighting, is the point of that over stylized lighting. The flip side of that would be something like German Expressionism, where the lighting is absolutely stark and uses a lot of chiaroscuro to represent a really great term that I took from this chapter, psychological reality. There is a reality here that they want to represent, and it's not real life. It's the reality of the production itself. And this is a term that sorely was missing from the last part of this chapter. Anything that discussed context or failed to discuss context when talking about signs and symbols. Psychological reality is a great way to summarize that. Those signs and symbols have meaning in the psychological reality of the piece. If I think back to what I was saying about denotation yesterday, denotation can show us a thing on screen, or it can denote a psychological thing on screen before we think about the meanings behind those things on screen. So there's an actor dressed as an astronaut is a denotation of what I see. Also, the psychological reality based on the context of the narrative makes me think this astronaut is in a dangerous location full of eggs. And then there's the connotations I can take out of that from then on. There's going to be something about birth, and there's going to be there's fertility and motherhood involved in this, and there's transgression of a mechanized humanoid approaching an egg. They're the transgressor here. Here is a sign of a human being bad. Actually, when the plot develops an alien, we know this is absolutely the other way. Only the aliens are the aggressors, very much so. But the connotations allow me to read that into it outside of just the denotation of there is an astronaut next to an egg. Okay, that was a bit of a digression. But psychological reality is something I will be coming back to, I think, because that is a very, very useful term, and something that can be applied to a lot of what we see here. Vloggers present a psychological reality to us. They aren't necessarily the people that we see on the camera. When we watch a popular vlogger, when we watch someone like PewDiePie, there are a lot of mannerisms and catchphrases and special voices and quirks of the presentation of their videos, which create this psychological reality of this character that's vlogging, not of the actual person that's often in the media for the wrong reasons, presenting themselves to a camera. The truth of the videos on YouTube is subjective, and I would say maybe twofold, maybe more than twofold. There is a person in front of the camera. There is a psychological truth of the person in front of the camera in terms of how they want to see themselves. One of my wife's favorite vloggers would be Coach Greg, and I was struck. I'd never seen any of Coach Greg's videos before, and I was struck by his voice, just being so loud and abrasive and so expressive, and so similar to Gilbert Gottfried. However, I learned from my wife that that's not actually his real voice. But just from seeing a couple of his videos, I assume that is his voice, and therefore he's created this character. And a term we can use now is psychological reality. There's a psychological reality that exists in a Coach Greg video. This is what this video is going to sound like. This is the voice we're going to hear. This is the character we're dealing with. But that's not necessarily actually the truth. So YouTube has this interesting tension between an absolute feeling of truth in what you're watching. You're seeing someone speak to camera and you're assuming that is a person speaking to camera, and there's nothing more to it. And then there's the actual truth behind that. There's the person that's constructed the video. So YouTube is an art form that has something dishonest about it. At its core, everything possibly is a performance. Cinema is performative, whether it's striving for reality, whether it's documentary, whether it's complete fiction and studio lit and uses a lot of CG. Everything about it is a performance. The people constructing the film, striving for reality, are performing their skill set to the best they can to present this piece of reality. A documentary filmmaker has edited this piece. It's a performance. This isn't reality without filter. This is a performance. YouTube gives us people talking to camera, much like I'm doing now, without edit, without effects, without anything happening. However, it is a performance at its heart, and it doesn't present itself as such. We aren't buying into a performance. We're buying into an idea that this is real. This is what we wanted to see. These are just real people doing real things. There was one last thing to mention. Oh, it's just to briefly mention, to recall to myself for later. It was a conversation I had with my wife yesterday, and it was on this subject. And she mentioned a podcast that we'd both heard before, about nuclear waste and how to describe nuclear waste as dangerous to future civilizations, like 10,000 years in the future. It's a really interesting idea to me, specifically because it's talking about signs and symbols and language and how to communicate, and doesn't necessarily feed too much into this discussion when we're getting into YouTube, but is a very good linguistical examination of how we do that. I tracked the podcast down, and it's from 99% Invisible. I'll post the link below. To be honest, after I listened to it again, I was a little disappointed with what I heard, and there's a sense of disappointment in it as well. Like the organizing bodies of the people trying to come up with this rejected some of what they viewed as the better ideas, color changing cats, in favor of giant stone statues. I don't know, but you can give it a listen. It's interesting, and I'm going to come back to it myself at some point, I'm sure. Okay, let's leave it there.